Morning and a Freilich and Chanukah. We are in Memdal Amud Beis, 42b. 42b. 44b. We're at the final comment of the Gemara in this chapter before we get to the next chapter. So this chapter came on the heels of the discussion about mitzvah shebadibur, mitzvahs of verbalization, and whether to be done in Hebrew in the original Hebrew or in any language. And that began with the Sotah, where one is obligated to the Kohen is obligated to administer an oath. A specific mitzvah, this chapter is discussing, is the mitzvah of the speech given by the priest, who's anointed for this purpose, as well as the officers, as people are about to go to battle. So this whole chapter became about that speech, which discusses first not being afraid, and then exemptions, and then dismissals. Yeah. So it became essentially a discussion about who's obliged to be in battle and who's not, who's dismissed, who's exempt, who's dismissed. So that's what this chapter became about. The next chapter will be about another mitzvah that has to be done in the original Lashon Kodesh, to Eglah Rufa, as we'll discuss.
This whole thing came about as a result.
This whole thing came about
from administering the oath.
That's right.
Wow, far back.
It's the Mishnah is designed to include all these various different laws,
right.
using various different segues. Right. So the segue into this law is from the discussion of the fact that the Kohen's speech, the administered oath that he gives to the Sotah, is to be done in the original Hebrew, and from there we went to other mitzvahs that are done in the original Hebrew, and we discussed those mitzvahs.
Like, won't use the forest for the trees.
Yeah. Well, the Mishnah does this on purpose.
No, for sure.
Right. Now, the last comment in the Mishnah is what kind of war gets these exemptions at all, or dismissals, and what kind of war does not. And the Mishnah, stated two opinions, which are not very clear, not very defined, which the Gemara is going to do for us, going to clarify and define it for us. But even the Gemara itself requires some help of Rashi. So let's look at the fourth line from the top, which is the Mishnah. So after the Mishnah discusses the exemptions and the dismissals from combat, says the Mishnah, top of 44b, fourth line. The Medvar Mamurim, that's what that Beis Daled Al stands for. When is all the above stated, in which there are exemptions and dismissals? In an elective war, meaning a war that is allowed. That's what the word reshus means, permitted. It's a war that is allowed by Torah law, but not mandated. That's when we offer exemptions and dismissals. But when it comes to a mitzvah, a war that is a mitzvah, it's a command from Hashem to wage this war. Hakol yotzin, everyone is to go to battle. No exemptions, no dismissals. Afilu chasen mechedroi, even a chasen from his room, a groom, the kala mechupasa, and a bride from her chuppah, from her canopy. Again, I mentioned this when we learned the Mishnah. I'm not really sure what this Mishnah means here. I'm sure the commentators discussed this because a woman doesn't go to battle. Maybe it means she has to go to be in the supportive units, but even so, women aren't usually drafted into battle. Certain combat units, and also there's a change in language. Chasen from his room, the kala from her chuppah, whatever. Just something to point out. It's not going to be discussed in the Gemara. I'm just pointing it out. Okay, so this is the first opinion. The first opinion is there's two tiers of war. Tier 1 is elective. Tier 2, mitzvah. Elective, that's when the exemptions apply. Mitzvah, no exemptions apply. Even the chasen is yanked from his room to go to war. Yeah? Comes second opinion. Amar Rabbi Huda states, the medvar mamurim, when do we apply the exemptions and dismissals? Mitzvah, during a war of a mitzvah. When the war is a mitzvah, then there's exemptions and dismissals.
Seems like the opposite.
Hold on a second. But when it comes to a war of obligation, Rabbi Huda gives two tiers as well. Everybody goes to battle, even a chasen from his room and a kala from her chuppah, from her canopy. So we have two opinions. each of which group 2 tiers. Okay. So opinion number 1 is the 2 tiers are reshus, elective, and B, mitzvah. Opinion 2 is the 2 tiers are mitzvah and chayva. Mitzvah and obligation, which give us a total, seemingly, of 3 tiers of war. Elective, each one more stringent than the next. Elective being the lowest of them, mitzvah being above that, and chayva, obligation, being above that. Just so we don't get confused in this language. In halacha, there are sometimes things that are called mitzvah that aren't obligation, right? Obligation, just to make it clear, the word mitzvah means commandment, right? So if Hashem commands you to do something, it becomes an obligation, right? But mitzvah also comes to mean not just commandment, but also comes to mean the fulfillment of something that's what Hashem requests. So there are times when, for example, if you do something, you get the mitzvah, but if you didn't, no obligation was left unfulfilled. Hashem provides another opportunity to do a mitzvah. So sometimes over there is obligation. I'm trying to think of an example. The mitzvah. Sometimes Rambam will write such a language where you do certain. I can't think of an example right now, but you do certain things and you get a mitzvah for doing it, but it isn't obligation. If you don't do it, I'm not sure if that counts, because under certain circumstances it is an obligation, isn't it? If you wanted it,
you get the merit. If you didn't do it, you're not obligated.
Right.
Hey.
Maybe that's an example, yeah. So those are the 3 tiers. Reshus, mitzvah, and chayva. Each one successively more stringent than the next. Elective, mitzvah, and obligatory. That's the way we would assume now, right? And what's the dispute between the sages and the Rabbi Yehuda at this point? How high up do you have to go before you say no exemptions? And the first opinion is you go to tier 2 mitzvah, no exemptions, because exemptions only apply to elective. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda would say, seemingly at this point, and we would read, if we read the Mishnah without the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda would say, oh, mitzvah war, exemptions do apply. Exemptions are revoked in obligatory, the higher one. That's what we would understand from Mishnah at the moment. Come to the Gemara and change the way we understand it. So let's see. So now we're going to the Gemara. So if we go toward the end of the, before the next chapter begins, right? The line begins with the words, Beis Dalad Aleph. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9 lines up from the end of the chapter. The line starts with the words, Beis Dalad Aleph. You see it?
How many lines from there?
8 lines up from the end of the chapter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Beis Dalad Aleph. You see it? Okay. So the Gemara begins by quoting the relevant section of the Mishnah. The Medvar Mamurim, when does the law of exemptions apply? When the war is of a elective nature, chulu, etc. Keep on reading the Mishnah because that's what we're going to comment on. We just read it. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says there are actually only 2 tiers of war, not 3. Right? Even though we had 3 different titles: reshus, elective, mitzvah, and then chayva, obligation. Rabbi Yochanan says actually only 2. There's only 2 tiers. The question is how you title them. Namely, says Rabbi Yochanan, reshus b'rabbanan, that which the first opinion, the sages, refer to as elective, in which there is no where there is exemptions. Zuhi mitzvah d'Rabbanan, that is the exact same war that Rabbi Yehuda refers to as mitzvah, in which there is exemptions. So they're both talking about the same war. The sages call it reshus, and Rabbi Yehuda calls it mitzvah. Why the difference in title if they're both the same thing? Well, explains Rashi as it emerges from the Gemara later. There's another element here. Our Mishnah only discusses exemption or no exemption. When do exemptions apply at the lower tier? No exemptions apply at the higher tier. That's what our mission discussed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And both Rabbi Yehuda and the sages agree there's a lower tier in which exemptions do apply. The sages call that elective. Rabbi Yehuda calls that mitzvah. And then there's a higher tier which exemptions don't apply, which mitzvah derabanan. That's what the sages refer to as mitzvah. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda calls chayva. Clear?
Mm-hmm.
So why the change in title if they're both the exact same law? Lower tier exemption, higher tier no exemption. Lower tier exemption, the sages call reshus, elective. Rabbi Yehuda calls mitzvah. And the higher tier no exemption, Rabbi Yehuda calls chayva, obligatory, and the sages call mitzvah. Why difference in title?
By one step.
So it's actually only two wars. That's the point. It's only two sets of war, just different labels.
Calling it different things.
Exactly. So why are we calling it different things? So as Rashi explains,
chayva and mitzvah.
that's right. Well, it's let's see for a second why there's another. Why we give? In other words, yes. So that's right. So when the sages say there's a war of a mitzvah, they actually mean an obligatory war, but they're referring to it as mitzvah, right? So explain to Rashi like this: there's another law here at stake. The only law we mentioned in the Mishnah is exemption and no exemption, but there's another law at stake here, which is ha'osik b'mitzvah poter min mitzvah. One who is involved in a mitzvah is exempt from a different mitzvah. First example in Shas, a chassan who's getting married is exempt from Shema because he's preoccupied with the mitzvah of being married, of being intimate with his wife. This is the principle. If you were involved in one mitzvah, you're exempt from a different mitzvah. So now the question becomes, what do I call this war? The label I give it is not just a label, but it changes the law. Not just the law of exemption, but am I obligated to do another mitzvah at the time? So this lower tier war, from which exemptions do apply, the person who's in that battle, are they exempt from other mitzvahs or not? Exemptions apply because it's the lower tier. Does this guy who's at war, well, the sages refer to it as a shus. They refer to it as elective. And therefore, this person is obligated to do other mitzvahs because he's not involved in a mitzvah in battle.
Therefore, he's exempt.
Therefore, he's obligated to do other mitzvahs. You're only exempt from one mitzvah if you're involved in another mitzvah.
Exempt
But if this mitzvah is, again, exemptions apply to this lower tier. But the guy who's not exempt from battle, he is in combat. Is he exempt from other mitzvahs? Not exempt from battle. Is he exempt from other mitzvahs? Well, the question is the mitzvah involved in, is the warrior involved in a mitzvah? Exemptions apply. We've got that out of the way. That's the lower tier.
Exemptions apply.
And whoever doesn't belong in battle at home, it's 2 weeks later, the battle is raging. There's a guy in combat. Is he exempt from putting on tefillin? Is he exempt from saying Shema? Well, is this war a mitzvah or not? According to the sages, the lower tier for which exemptions apply, it's called a reshus, it's called a elective war. And therefore, whoever actually makes it to the battlefield is not exempt from other mitzvahs. Because it's a reshus.
Right.
But that very same war, Rabbi Yehuda calls that war a mitzvah. To tell you that the guy who's in combat, even though exemptions applied, and some of the people aren't even in combat, the guy who has a new house or whatever, but the guy who did make it to combat, he is engaged in a mitzvah, and thus exempt from other mitzvahs.
Talking about different things.
It's the same war,
Same war,
but giving it a different title because there's another law that our mission does not discuss that gets applied based on the title.
Right, but it has nothing to do with whether they have to go home or not.
Exactly.
Whether or not they're obligated to do other mitzvahs
Exactly.
while they're in battle.
Exactly. So what the Rabbi Yochanan is telling us is the dispute in the Mishnah should not be understood to mean that there are different wars in which the exemptions apply and different wars in which the exemptions don't apply. Says Rabbi Yochanan, that's not true. Everybody agrees there are higher tier war where exemptions don't apply. There's a lower tier war which exemptions do apply. The question is, how do I label the lower war? The lower war in which exemptions do apply.
The soldier needs to.
The soldier who's not exempt and is in combat, is he exempt from other mitzvahs or not? Whatever. So the sages say that's an elective war, and therefore he is obligated in other mitzvahs. Huda says it's called a mitzvah, and therefore he's not obligated in other mitzvahs. The guy who's actually in combat. Now, because they're arguing with the lower war, then they have to give a higher title to the next war. There's only 2 wars. So according to the sages, that they labeled the lower war as rishos, obligatory, elective. All they have to do is call the one up mitzvah. Whereas Yehuda, who called the lower war mitzvah already, he's got to give the next one a higher title. So he calls it chayva.
Right.
But not because it's more obligated than the other one.
I think it's not 3. I think there's 2
Only
subdivisions of elective.
No. Well, there is mitzvah.
No, but if once you're on obligatory, doesn't it include mitzvahs?
Again, the point that we're trying to make is that there is only 2 types of war:
Right.
obligatory or elective. But how do you title the elective one, and how do you title the obligatory one? According to Rabbi Yehuda, even the elective one is titled a mitzvah. It's titled a mitzvah because even though it's an elective war, but the guy who's drafted to this elective war, he is doing a mitzvah by being in that war, and thus exempt from other mitzvahs, even though it's an elective war. Following?
But not all elective wars are mitzvah.
That's the point.
Right.
According to Yehuda, it is. Oh, 1 second. According to Yehuda, it is. But a mitzvah for what degree? Not a mitzvah because, okay, let's make it clear. The king and the Sanhedrin decide this is a legit war. It's not a mitzvah because we're not killing out Amalek. We're not kicking Jews out of Eretz. We're not kicking invaders out of Eretz Yisrael.
Land acquisition.
Whatever it is. But once the Sanhedrin says this is a legit war, and the king now drafts, me, Levi, knew who's drafted. Am I doing a mitzvah by going to war or not? Even though it's an elective battle.
I think in that case, yes, because the Sanhedrin.
That's the dispute. Rabbanan say, even though I'm being drafted, because inherently it's an elective war, therefore I'm not fulfilling a mitzvah in doing so. I'm doing my duty as a citizen, but I'm not fulfilling a mitzvah, and therefore I have to pause to put on tefillin. According to Yehuda, you've been drafted, even though inherently it's an elective war, but you've been drafted, so you're fulfilling a mitzvah, and therefore you are exempt from other mitzvahs. But it's only one war they're talking about, just giving it a different title. So now, when they're talking about wars, which the Sanhedrin is obligated to do, there's an invader, or whatever the mitzvah is. So now it's an obligatory war. Both the Yehuda and the sages agree it's an obligatory war. But what do I title that obligatory war? Chayva or mitzvah? Well, all I have to do is title it one up from the one below it. So according to the sages, where the one below it is called elective, call this one mitzvah. According to Yehuda, where the one below it is called mitzvah, call this one chayva. But the law is the same, according to both opinions. Follow that? Yeah or no? It's nuanced. If we're not, sorry. Let's make it more clear. Let's make it more clear. The dispute is only about the lower tier war. Only. The higher tier war, there's no dispute whatsoever.
That's categorically everyone has to do.
The higher war, everyone has to participate, and whoever participates is exempt from doing mitzvahs.
Right.
Okay, that's clear. Out the way. Right?
Right. That's how
done. Now, what's the machlekes about the lower war? Since it's only 2 wars.
I think it's whether all.
Not what you think. What did the Gemara tell us?
Well, I'm trying to understand.
Yeah. Okay. So get to me.
So whether the elective is mitzvah or not.
Correct. Is the elective war a mitzvah?
Dispute.
That's correct. But it's not because. Right. So they all agree the lower war gets the exemption, and the higher war doesn't get exemptions. Exemptions meaning guys who are exempt from battle.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, good. You said exactly right. The lower tier war, is it labeled a elective, and therefore the person who goes to battle is not exempt from other mitzvahs?
Right.
Or is it labeled a mitzvah,
right.
and the guy who goes to battle is exempt from other mitzvahs? Okay. So that's why so the dispute comes down to, do I label the lower war rishus or mitzvah? So once I label the lower war, the higher war, I have to label it a one level up. So if I'm right,
mitzvah.
Well, if I call the lower one rishus, then I can call the one above it mitzvah. But if I'm already calling the lower one mitzvah, what am I going to call the higher one?
Right.
Call it chayva. But not because I'm actually disputing whether it's obligatory or not. Both agree that the higher war is obligatory, and both agree the higher war, the guys who are in battle, are exempt from other mitzvahs.
Right.
It's just a question of title. I have to title it one up from the one below it.
For sure.
So if I label the elective war,
then you have to call the higher one. No,
that's right. And if I label the lower one mitzvah, I got to call the higher one chayva. That's it.
And that was the confusion why some may have thought there were 3 levels. But there's really only 2.
That's correct.
How you label the first one.
That's right. Got it. Excellent. Beautiful. Now let's go weiter. Now, Rava is actually going to throw a little bit of a wrench. He's actually explaining Rabbi Yochanan. He's not, as Rashi explains, he's not disputing Rabbi Yochanan. He's explaining Rabbi Yochanan and says the following. Amar Rava, Rava says, Melchemes Yeshua, Lichboish. If we were to talk about a war that looks like the war of Yeshua to conquer the land of Israel, Divrei Hakol Chayva. Everybody agrees that that's considered obligatory. No exemptions apply. Everybody's got to go. Plus, if you're involved in that war, you're exempt from other mitzvahs. Clearly. Okay. Malchemes Beis David leRavacha. A mitzvah, a war, of King David, just to expand territory. Rashi actually says here, leRavacha, where is it? A certain war that King David waged against Aram Tzova to expand the territory and to collect more taxes from the people there. Okay? Let's say it's that kind of war. Says Rava, even explaining Rabbi Yochanan, we're just literally just expanding territory. Everybody agrees that that's considered a voluntary war. And therefore, exemptions apply for those who have new homes and whatnot. And if you're involved in that mitzvah, if you're involved in that war, you're not exempt from other mitzvahs because you're just expanding territory.
Right.
Okay. So keep pligi. Where's the dispute as to how so we're actually, according to Rabbi, there actually is to be left 3 tiers. There's that which everybody labels obligatory. You've got to conquer the land of Israel like Yeshua. No exemptions, and yes, exemptions for mitzvah. No exemptions for battle, yes, exemptions for other mitzvah. Mm-hmm. There's mitzvahs that everybody agrees is purely elective war, and therefore, even if you're drafted, first of all, exemptions apply for those who have new homes and whatnot, and B, you're not exempt from other mitzvahs because this whole war to begin with is just to expand territory. But there's a third kind of war. So there actually is 3 tiers, right? Pligi, where's the dispute as to how I label the mitzvah, the war? When there's a war to diminish non-Jews that are a threat, that they shouldn't come on to us. So it's not an existential threat because they haven't attacked us yet. But they're lurking about, and we're stressed that it might become an issue. That's right. That's right. So to what degree is this preemptive strike count as an obligatory battle? So Ma'ari Koryole mitzvah. Rabbi Yehuda refers to this as a mitzvah. And therefore, no exemptions apply. And therefore, even though exemptions apply for the guy who has a new house and whatnot. But because we're calling it a mitzvah, because it's a preemptive strike against those who are going to attack us, if you're involved in that battle, you're exempt from other mitzvahs. The sages refer to this as elective. Even though it's an important war, and if you're drafted, you got to go. But we're labeling it as a elective war to inform you that if you happen to be drafted, you're not exempt from other mitzvahs.
So it's like a subcategory. Now it would be a subcategory of elective.
Exactly. Either a subcategory. Elective plus mitzvah. According to Buddha, it's elective plus mitzvah. According to the sages, it's just elective. Right. That's correct.
That would be a third category.
So there is a third category now. So the premise of Rabbi Yochanan still applies, that they're arguing about the same war, not about different wars. Right? In other words, let's rephrase that. Rabbi Yochanan's logic still applies that this dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages are not about when do the exemptions of our mission apply. The exemptions of who goes home apply equally according to both opinions. Right?
It's still elective.
Because it's still elective.
One's a mitzvah.
The only question is, that's correct. Do I label it mitzvah or elective for the guys who are drafted? Are they exempt from other mitzvahs? As the Gemara concludes.
This war would qualify.
That's correct.
A mitzvah.
That's right.
In terms of whether they are exempt from other
according to Rabbi Yehuda. Nafkamina, what's the difference whether you label it
then you can't label up then in that case, you'd have
Well,
to
you always
call-
have to label up.
You have to, no, I mean, you can't label up as a mitzvah then.
You have to call it
label
chayva.
as chayva.
That's correct. That's right. So nafkamina, what would be the difference? How I label it? Says the Gemara, which we already introduced earlier, because Rashi told us, lasik b'mitzvah shepoter by mitzvah. Mitzvah. That if this person classified as someone who's involved in a mitzvah to exempt from a different mitzvah? That's the question of how you label it, even though they're talking about the same wars. So there actually is 3 levels of war.
Or it's just a modification.
It's a modification.
A subdivision of elective.
So there's 3 levels of war. There's
two, like two parts to the elective, and then the higher one.
That's correct.
Or you could
So there's
say
elective
it's
to.
really-
Well, you could say there's 3.
really a hybrid of elective.
Yeah. So there's one.
Elective.
That's right. There's one that's just expanding territory. Exemptions apply for battle, clearly. Plus, those who are in battle are not exempt from other mitzvahs because it's just an elective war to expand territory.
Right.
Then one level up, there is a pending threat, preemptive strike. Okay. So that exemptions apply. And if you have a new house or a new wife, go home. But if you're in that battle, now we have a dispute. The Buddha says it's classified as mitzvah and thus you're exempt from other mitzvahs. Sages say, sorry, it was elective. You're still left to do other
Oh, they
mitzvahs.
just keep it
That's correct.
to
That's correct.
no matter what.
Level 3 is the highest level where you're literally conquering the land of Israel as described by Torah under Yeshua. Then certainly no exemptions apply. Everybody's got to come to battle, even the guy coming from his chuppah, even
You're
the
exempt from mitzvah. You're in
and you're exempt from mitzvah if you're involved in that war. Because this is the most direct mitzvah you can the most central mitzvah of all Torah. Go conquer the land of Israel. Yeah. Anyway, by divine providence, we're learning this on Hanukkah, right? Because there is a whole discussion in some of the commentaries as to what exactly was the level of the war of Hanukkah.
I would think that would be the Haiva.
It's a good question. It's a good question because it didn't start out as an existential physical threat. It was a spiritual threat.
But
Right.
That's the essence of.
Yeah, and but they're also occupied territory. So certainly there's. It would seem that it was a chayva because the Kohanim went and I don't know. I should leave it alone. But I just know it's discussed. In any event, it's by divine providence that we're discussing at the same time. Kapanim, have a wonderful day, Eden, and a Freichen Chanukah. It's always a Geschmack of Gemara to be able to break your brain to absorb as much of God's Torah as we possibly can. That's what this is all about. It's Hashem's Torah, Hashem's wisdom, and it's on us to use our minds to understand as best we can. And we thank Hashem for making His Torah enclosed in language that even humans like me and you can understand. It's divine wisdom. It's infinite. How could humans understand it? By divine grace that He condensed His wisdom into words that we can kind of get a window into understanding a little bit of Hashem's Torah. And we're grateful for that. A wonderful day, Yidden.